Thank you to Cohort 11 for coming in. So I'm very excited to present to you this guest speaker. So Justin Schram is someone that you may have already seen and not even realized it, because if you walked through our Nexus and you've seen the Sultans of Scratch video, you will notice him doing some kind of little hip-hop, a little back and forth action going on, something like that. That is Justin Schram. Justin Schram was a producer here at FIEA, and somewhere in the spring, I think it was, or fall, we'd had a guest speaker from Bethesda, the lead level designer there, Joel Burgess, who came down with us, and he interviewed, and Justin blew him away. And Joel just loved Justin immediately. He was telling me how he's like, I want to hire this guy, but I don't see anything on his portfolio yet, level design-wise. Justin didn't have much built up on his portfolio in that way yet. So Joel told me, he might not have told you this. He's like, if this guy can level design at all in any tool, I want him, right? And so it was at that point that we had a conversation, and he was going to submit a level to Bethesda using GEC, which was what they used to call the creation kit. Garden of Eden, I believe?
Yeah.
The Garden of Eden creation kit, which was the Fallout 3 editor for their level editor. And so Justin started opening that tool. He hadn't used it before, ever, but he created an awesome level layout and design and character work and quests and missions and all this kind of stuff. And I remember having conversations with him at Jimmy John's about what he was going to do and how he was going to create these characters. And he created a really fantastic, awesome level, which of course further blew away Joel Burgess, and he did get hired. He's been there for the past 6 years at Bethesda, working as a level designer on Skyrim and now Fallout 4, which is coming in November. It's going to consume my life. I go into the vault and exit the vault many times, many vaults. And so he's going to be talking about iterative design and some of the things that are involved with level design. So I'm sure you guys will be able to enjoy that. So please join me in welcoming Justin Schram.
Hey guys. So yeah, as Ron said, I've been with Bethesda Game Studios for about 6 years now as a level designer. And so I worked on Skyrim. I had about 40 dungeons in that game that I was responsible for. And then I worked on the Dawnguard expansion, did a few more dungeons in that. Dragonborn was actually, if you played that expansion, there's this like alternate dimension called Apocrypha that you can go to. I was responsible for coming up with that world. And then, of course, currently working on Fallout 4, which we haven't announced too much about, so I can't talk too much about in this talk, unfortunately. But I'll drop little tidbits about my work there where I can. It's unfortunate because some of my best work is in that game. But so what does a level designer do at Bethesda? Obviously, we do dungeons, coming up with maps, all the encounter design, the combat, the loot, everything in there. But we also do what's called POIs and points of interest. We have these big, expansive open worlds, and we're sort of one of the teams responsible for filling that world with interesting things to do. So this is one of them in Skyrim, for example. We also do what's called random encounters. So while you're wandering the world, if a random NPC wanders up to you and asks for something, or some random thing wants to fight you, that might be because of a level designer placing something in this world. We also do exterior combat, gameplay spaces, places where you do combat, maybe like a battle zone. If you're familiar with Skyrim, a lot of the Civil War battles were set up by level designers. We also actually fit quests into a lot of our dungeons. So I had a dungeon in Skyrim called Darklight Tower, and like you go in there and you meet an NPC who needs help from you, and then you spend that whole dungeon with that NPC, and there's a whole story to her. So we do things like that. We also work with quest designers who like have quests come to our dungeons. We're also responsible for game systems. Lightly, we're sort of working our way into that territory. On Fallout 4, actually I got to help develop one of the perks, which I can't talk about, but I want to. So we do scripting. Script a lot of puzzles, traps, scripted sequences in dungeons. And then something kind of unique to Bethesda is kit development, coming up with the different kits that we use to make our dungeons. We work with artists pretty close on that, and I'll get more into that later. And then also tools development. So we have our proprietary kit called the Creation Kit, which is our editor. And we actually work a lot with the programming team to work on
making it more and more usable, making it, having more tools, more ways to interface and create the game. And obviously there's a lot more that I'm not mentioning, but it's just some of the things we do, so lots. And we work with pretty much the whole team. So we work with environment art, for like what I said, kit development. We make a lot of art requests. I'll talk about that more later. Working with landscaping on the dungeon exteriors. Character art, obviously, for encounters, the things you fight. Unique creature requests, like if I want something to be pink randomly, I go to character art and be like, hey, can I have a pink zombie? And they'll make one for me, which I have done. So we work with effects artists for things like explosion traps, blah, blah, blah. Animation, if we want like you to come in and somebody is picking a lock and we don't have that animation yet, we'll have to go to the animation department. Obviously, quest design, we work with very, very closely. We sit next to each other, departments. Tools programmers, as I mentioned. AI programmers, this is actually interesting. So we have this thing called the default master package, which basically governs how all actors act in our game. It's sort of like a default AI procedure that we can put on an actor. And we're working really close with AI a lot of the time to add more behaviors to that. Like, are they sleeping? Are they patrolling around a dungeon? Are they guarding something? We have one sort of package to rule them all, and we keep adding things onto that. And sometimes we need really unique behaviors. Like for that perk I mentioned, but I can't talk about. I'm sorry, I keep doing that to you guys. And then obviously sound requests. And then we actually work a lot with QA. For example, like if I'm working on a system, I'll need to be like, hey, QA, you really need to hit this hard. This is potential to break the entire game. And also getting clarifications on a lot of bugs, which I'll get more into later. So our games are big. We have the Map of Oblivion here, Fallout 3, and Skyrim, which had over 200 locations. And we need a way to manage building all of those. It's huge. Like I said, I had 40 of the dungeons in Skyrim and multiple POIs. I think there was over 250 different locations to work in that game. So we need a system that allows us to churn through that much content. It can become really overwhelming. So how do we do it? So we use what we call iterative design. It's basically an approach of taking the same, well, I'll take a dungeon, through the entire process. We do passes on it. So it starts as just the most basic idea of what a dungeon can be, and then we take it through multiple passes where we work on different aspects of it. So in the first pass, we'll just lay it out, and then we take some time, we let it simmer, and we get a lot of feedback on it. And it could be months before working on the same dungeon again. We could start at the beginning of a project, and then 8 months later return to it again. But at that time, we have more of an idea of what the game is, and we have more of an idea of like how people have reacted to our dungeon in between these passes. So the benefits of this method is that at every phase of the project, a level designer has something to do. In the beginning, we may not have art to create these dungeons, but we're able to sort of do the best with what we have and then come back to it later when there's more available to us. And also, it's really good to take some time away from it and then come back with a fresh mind. A lot of times I'll come back to my first pass dungeon, so I'm like, what was I thinking? This is awful. And then I'll have the chance to go back to it and change stuff and make it better. It's funny, like at the end of the project, coming back to the first dungeon that I made on the project, completely uninformed about what the game was and just how much more you can add to it by doing that way. So it's really valuable to be able to leave and come back to the same level throughout the project. And obviously, we get as much feedback as possible on the level. There's a lot of time for multiple people to play it and take a look at it and say if we like it or something. So as a result, the level designer needs different skills for every stage of the project. So each pass has a different name. Well, it's just numbered, but we call it. It means a lot. So each pass has different focuses that we sort of look at when we're developing dungeons. So the first pass is pass 0. I don't know why we didn't start at 1. Doesn't make sense, but yeah, it works. But it basically means we're not building the dungeon yet. We're planning, we're pitching, we're writing up documents. At this stage, we have a vague idea of what the game is going to be. But we have the world, and we have sort of the main focus of the game, and we are basically given free one day to come up with an idea per dungeon, and we write a pitch. So for every dungeon, we're given a name, just sort of picked out of a hat. We're allowed to change it, but sometimes it helps to like give us a starting point of like, all right, this is dark light cavern. What does that mean? Like, how do I get inspired by that? And then we're given an encounter type. So like dark light cavern, for example, was the Falmer, or the snow elves. So they're kind of creepy and they make living caves. And then we're also given a location type, obviously. So for this example, is a cave. And then we sort of like come up with a unique and interesting dungeon around it. We try to have every dungeon try to have its own identity, you know, based around those three things. It's easy. We get a lot of flack in Skyrim for having a million Draugr crypts. But, you know, we tried at least to have each one have a different theme, a little bit of a different story. We're getting a little bit better about that. But the whole idea is that this pitch is this back and forth thing. So we'll write, we have a Wikipedia wiki that we keep for all our dungeons, and each one has its own page. And we'll write up our pitch, and we'll do things like have a little small summary, and we'll write up, you know, what the gameplay in the space is, what the story is, and then we pitch it. Like we send it along to all the leads, and they read through it, and you know, sometimes they won't like something. But the whole idea is it's an elevator pitch. Like we're trying to keep it concise and descriptive to sell the idea, to really get the leads on board to what our idea for the dungeon is. So at this point, obviously, we have to develop a comfort with, you know, our ideas getting rejected. This is like I said, every day we're having to come up with a new pitch. You're trying to have a fresh idea, so you don't want to get too like attached to any idea you make, because you know sometimes you're not gonna like it. But the idea is that, you know, there's gonna be a lot of back and forth. You know, the leads have a, you know, very clear vision for the game, but we're also given a lot of freedom with the ideas we come up with, which is awesome. Like, you know, I could come up with a completely strange story for like a dungeon that has to do with like necromancers and weird sex fetishes, and they'll be like, yeah, sure, it sounds great. You know, it's very open. But when you're coming up with ideas, you want to ask yourself, what is this game about? Like, what is a player expecting when they come into my dungeon? Our games revolve around exploration, acquisition, and combat. So when we're developing dungeons, we want to know, how do we serve these ideas? You know, exploration is obviously probably the main one in a Bethesda game. Namely, like, a player wants to find sort of unique places, things that are just interesting, some things that have like a little bit of a story to it. They want to like live in this world and sort of go out and find cool things to do in it. And obviously acquisition is another huge one. We kind of want to like give the player something cool for coming into our dungeon, like a little reward, like, hey, thanks for visiting my dungeon. Here's a cool sword, you know. So the player is always going to be collecting stuff. So how can you serve that? So every space in the game, like I said, is an opportunity to tell a story. We could just be like, it's bear cave, there's bears in it. That's it. But instead, you could tell a story about like maybe a teenager had to run away from home because he was worshipping a god that was forbidden, and his parents kicked him out, so he ran away to live in this cave, and a bear ate him. And then you can find all this stuff, and there's a note. So that we always have an opportunity to tell a story in a game. Nothing just has to be a barricade. When we develop pitches for our games, we like to say, what was the space before the player came here, and what is it now? So in that bear cave example, maybe there used to be some like spider nest there, and then the bear moved in, and then this kid ran away from home, and he, you know, got eaten by the bear there. So that was the story then, but when the player comes there now, it's all about bears and fighting the bears. You know, a bad example, but whatever. So you want to learn what the player's experience will be as they explore the space. It's going to be about the player's experience and, you know, what they discovered, how they experienced your space. You want to think about what the player takes with them when they leave this dungeon. So the idea when we're pitching is just we want it to feel like an expansive world, and we want to fill it in with all these colorful details. So our first pass, this is when we're actually finally in the editor. We don't have much in the way of art yet, but we're starting to work with the artist on what we call kits. So we design our levels modularly, which means we take a bunch of little pieces and put them together in interesting and unique ways to make it feel like a natural space. So this is the Dwarven Ruin kit for Skyrim. And as you can see, like, we have it split into walls and ceilings and random fences and platforms. And we have a way of sort of putting all that together. And at this stage, for pass 1, it's just basic. It's just walls and ceilings, maybe like 2-way hallways, 3-way hallways. We're putting that together, and we're trying to make an interesting layout out of just this. But we're also interfacing with the artists. We're meeting with the artists probably every week on every kit. So on Fallout, I'm actually the level designer in charge of the Vault kit. So I went back and forth with the artists on that, on the things that the level designers are going to require. So we'll need things like elevators or certain set pieces for a quest, or things for creatures that pop out of the walls. Like, we just need all these different little pieces, and the artist doesn't necessarily know. Their goal is just to make a space that looks cool and makes that. So that is why we work together a lot with the level designers and the artists to sort of make those interesting decisions for the kit. So a lot of times, one of the interesting things when you're making a kit is stairs. Artists will usually want to make stairs that aren't practical to use. So a lot of times you'll have to work with them on doing things like switchbacks, just things, because they can get you up a level really quick without wasting a lot of space, which is something in our, I don't know if you know about Bethesda games, but we don't have ladders for some reason. There's good programmatic reasons. But so we end up having to use stairs a lot, but they take up a lot of space in our designs. So we have to work with kit artists a lot on being really economical with the way stairs take up space. So we do things like switchbacks. But that's why it's really important to work on kits together at the beginning of the project. So at the beginning of a level, you decide on what the layout features of your levels are. And there's a lot of different ways to lay out a level. So as you see at the top right here, that is a hub-based design. And that means a player comes into a large central space and then goes off onto these little branches and returns to the central space at different points. It's more of an open feeling layout. The player feels like it's more of an open space rather than being on a singular experience. You can also do a branching layout or a more linear layout. In Skyrim, we actually opted to keep our layouts more linear in general, just to sort of be a foil to the way the world itself is laid out. So we would have a lot of just single pass. We had branches, but it would always loop you back to the beginning. That's definitely a trademark of a Skyrim dungeon. But we try to find interesting ways to hide it and keep that like loop back, feeling organic for the level. Another thing we want to think of is where this is in the world and what it looks like on the exterior. A lot of times, on the first pass, we have nothing to build the exterior with. So we sort of have to think about that. Because what could happen is what we call Snoopy's doghouse. So in Snoopy, he goes in his doghouse, and it's like this huge mansion, but on the outside, it looks like just a little doghouse. So we want to sort of avoid that feeling. It's like you see this like little tower, and you walk in, and it's this big old space. You want to make it sort of match. Our rule of thumb in our games is usually about 70% match. Like, there's a little bit of fudging in there, but overall, we try to just make it feel like what it is on the outside. And same goes for things like windows or light coming in from certain places or wind coming in from certain places. This is a dungeon that's under a lake, like one I made called Golden Altus Deep. And how can you reflect things on the outside to make it feel like it's part of this world? So at this point, we want to keep the detail in it very low. It's just the layout, like I said, it's just those simple kit pieces. But we want to be able to sort of change it down the line. We have 4 more passes coming up after this. Things we don't want to get too attached to. So we try to stay out of things that take too much time or too much work. We just want a vague layout and then something that we can begin to get feedback on, which is the whole point of iterative design. So at this point, we want to develop comfort with showing our early work. Because it's going to be a lot of empty hallways, you don't necessarily want people running through that. That doesn't feel cool. You're like, okay, you're running through this, and you have to get really good at describing to people what your intentions are for a space, and be really colorful with your language, and really try to sell people on the idea, because a bunch of empty hallways are not going to inspire confidence in your leads. So we're creating visualizations with limited resources. We don't have very much to build with. We have the ability to use what we call LD art, level designer art. So in Skyrim early on, we had some planks that were made for us to, I don't know, build like a shack. So a lot of us, because we didn't have what we needed to build, like per se, we had this dungeon with a big ship inside of a cave. And so in this, instead of like asking art to build a kit, which would have taken maybe a month, some level designers built a ship out of just each individual plank and just laid it out like that, with like 200 different planks, and it like hurt performance, but it sold the idea of like, this is what we want here. But we want to do that sparingly, because it's proper use of our time. Like that probably took him hours that he could have just been like, I want a ship here. But there are times you want to do that. So, you can do it. It's a tool in our tool belt. So another thing we're also doing at this point is documenting art requests. So say you need that ship in your cave, but it has to like fill a certain function. Like you need to have cannons on the side that you can go up and like pull the trigger, and those cannons will shoot out the side. So you want to be very descriptive with that and make sure you know what you're getting. So this is actually a puzzle I worked on in Dawnguard, where you free the NPC that follows you for the rest of the DLC. But I actually was a little vague in my description of it when I first wrote it. So the idea is that there's 5 braziers around this central dais, and you have to push them to where the light is. And then like the whole floor drops out, and there's like a coffin in the middle, and she comes out, and you have a new friend. But when I first wrote this, it wasn't the best description, so I didn't get exactly what I was looking for. And it was a great learning experience for me. I'm like, all right, you have to really put in the time and like write a good description, because you're not going to get something back you necessarily asked for. Be very clear, and if you can, work directly with the artist, but that's not always possible. Your schedules aren't always going to line up. Okay, so we'll move on to pass 2. We are sort of refining the layout here. We're adding encounters for the first time. Now it's still relatively early in the project, so all of our encounters aren't necessarily developed. We might only have Draugr at this point, so we're focusing on those dungeons first. And we're also refining the layout a little bit. We're taking the feedback from our first pass and start honing in and chipping in on what the layout of the dungeon is. So one thing I like to do with the layout is set a player goal as soon as you come into the space. So for example, I have a dungeon in Skyrim called Duskglow Crevice. And you walk in, and there's this huge valley, and you see across the way, across this chasm, this temple. And there's like a really shiny like gem just like on a pillar there. And it's a way to like set a goal as soon as you come into a dungeon. Like, this is what I want. I see it. I'm going to get there somehow. And and also, of course, we're addressing layout feedback at this point. If that's not successful, then we need to find ways to make that successful. And we also want to watch out for something called decision stacks. So this is something that comes up in layouts, where you come upon a fork in a hallway, or you find a locked door, or there's just multiple ways to go in a dungeon. Every time that happens, a player chooses one of those ways to go. They may have missed this locked door because they don't have the proper lock-picking skill. And every time that split happens, a player keeps it in their head. They're like, okay, earlier in this dungeon there was another way I could have gone. Every time we do that, it stacks. It's another decision that the player made that stacks up, and the player feels like they're missing out on something, or maybe they weren't going the right way. So you want to sort of minimize that and give players as many chances as they can to realize sort of where they are in the dungeon and what they've missed, especially if it's a lockpick door that they may not have been able to have gone through. They could still get a good idea of what they were missing when they skipped that locked door. So we really want to minimize, not minimize branching, but just educate the player as much as they can on the layout of the space when it does branch. And at this point, we're also implementing puzzles and dialogue. I'll talk about this more later, but puzzles are a great way to affect the pacing of the space. And then dialogue, we have a lot of different ways to do this. We could have characters in your space, or you could have sort of like talking objects or notes. And like in Fallout, we have the option to do holotapes, which is a really cool tool that we've been able to use. So we're refining layout at this point, and we're using sort of larger clutter at this point. So in the space in Fallout 3, we have things like buses or large rubble piles to sort of guide the player. So instead of this long, empty tunnel, we have ways to sort of guide the player around. And so at this pass, we do begin to get these larger things come online. And at this point, we're really starting to watch people play. We have other level designers come and play the levels, and we watch them very closely. We watch the decisions they make. We watch where they get turned around. We watch, just every move they make, and we try to address, ways they went, and maybe if we're guiding people in a way that we don't want them to go, find ways to guide them back using things like rubble piles. There's actually a way to sort of guide people using what's called like subtle arrows. Like we can make things point in directions which sort of like subconsciously guide the player around a space. So like in this rubble pile here, we see there's actually a clear path going through here that the player can take. And we use just little ways like that to know where the player is, and then maybe we can put an ambush right behind this bus. So it lets us get people where we want them to be at certain points of the dungeon. And another thing, if you do find people going somewhere in a dungeon, a lot of the time that you don't intend on them going originally, find a way for that area that the player does keep returning to be rewarded by going there. So you can make cool little nooks and Easter eggs that way throughout the level. We're still avoiding spending too much time on over-cluttering the space because, like I said, time is an opportunity cost. And we want to be comfortable with changing the layout even past this point. So we don't want to spend too much time like cluttering a space if we're going to have to like blow up a whole room or like make a hallway turn the other direction. So moving on to third pass, we have a lot more of the game in place here. And our encounters are a lot further along. And we probably have an idea of what loot the player wants. So at this point, we have a good portfolio of all the feedback we've gotten on our space. And a lot of times, that feedback is going to be conflicting. We're going to have a lot of different opinions. And so we worked really closely with our lead to compile that feedback and decide what we're actually going to change and what we're going to address. And you have to get really good at knowing when people are having knee-jerk reactions at certain points in the project and what is actually valid feedback. So you're going to be having a lot of conversations with people on how they felt at certain points of the dungeon or how things affected them. At this point, we do have a more informed knowledge of the game mechanics in our game. This is about maybe 3/4 of the way through the project. We have a lot more encounters. Instead of just Draugr, we have, the Weber automatons. We have a lot of the bears. We have things just in the entire game that we can use. And we know how different creatures react and how different creatures behave. We have melee. We have ranged. We have different lists we can place. We know what loot is valuable. We know what traps we can use. So this is something that came on late in the project. Skyrim was just cooking. And we didn't know what ingredients would be valuable early on in the project. So when we're placing random food items throughout a dungeon, we don't know what the player wants at this point. So once these recipes came online, for example, Elsewhere Fondue was one that I found very useful when I played through the game. It added a lot more magic regeneration, which is sweet. I would place these ingredients together a lot of the time just to be like, oh, hey, cool reward, all these ingredients together. But that's something we didn't know in the first 2 passes. So we're also implementing game systems at this point. So things like workbenches in Skyrim, which this is the enchanting table. We didn't have any of those early on to begin with. So this is why in the earlier passes we leave room. We don't overclutter. We don't try to do too much with what we have because there's a lot more coming online as we go through the project. So if I overcluttered a corner, I would have to take it all out to put this enchanting workbench in. But at this point, third pass is when that time comes to sort of start filling up the empty spaces. So the layout should be completely set at this point. This is the last time we're going to be blowing up any layout changes, like taking a whole room and moving it, or changing the way a hallway turns. This is when we should finalize where we are. So we think about pacing a lot earlier in the project, but this is the first time we can really, really get into like what the pacing of a dungeon is. So I like to think of a dungeon as following sort of a standard story structure. If you're not familiar, it's the inciting incident, the climax, that whole thing, or how you go through a story. But I think of it more as a player story, and this is sort of what pacing is when you go through a dungeon or any experience in a game. So you enter a dungeon, and we don't like to throw a lot at you immediately. We're establishing the universe like we do in a story. We actually have a rule in creating dungeons in our games called the sandwich rule. So that if a player enters through a load door, they should be able to get up and go make a sandwich and feel safe, like their character's not going to die if they leave the world. So it's a sandwich rule. But it also works for pacing. If you enter a dungeon, you get attacked right away, you're just going to be on immediately. You want to sort of like get them set in the world of the dungeon that you're building. And then you do little things like you ratchet it up. You start to do little encounters. You start to add points of interest, loot, and you find this like nice little curve that you get the player to follow, leading to a climax, fighting the big boss, getting the cool loot, and then finding their way out. It's a cool way to sort of experience it. And you can also do this with the story of the dungeon, like if you have an NPC with you, if you have a story happening in the space. So what we're really looking for when a player's playing through a dungeon is flow. So if you're not familiar with the concept of flow, it's that perfect state between anxiety or frustration and boredom. We want the player to be in this perfect middle where they're having fun, they're like living in this dungeon, they're not, they don't want to put the controller down, which is if they get too frustrated, they're going to turn the game off, or they'll put the controller down and leave. They'll never want to play your game again. And again, it's the same thing on the other side if they're bored. You want to sort of like keep their interest in this middle place, and it's a balancing act. You don't want your game to be too hard, but you also don't want it to be too easy. So to avoid just always being on, we have this thing we call the leaky faucet, which is if you're going through a dungeon and you just have like enemy after enemy after enemy just slowly leaking at you through the whole time. We want to balance intense moments of combat, these exciting moments, with just some downtime, some exploration, some quiet moments. So we want to decide where the hotspots in the dungeon are. So it'll be like a place where you can get the awesome loot, little places where there's like collections of gold or a treasure chest or something like that. We want to cluster those. It's the same thing with the leaky faucet with encounters. We don't want a leaky faucet of loot. We want these places that draw your eye that you're going to go to and find them. And it's a good way for the level designer, again, to know where the player is at a specific time, because we pretty much know you're going to be going for the cool loot. It's like I said with the main core mechanics of our games, acquisition is a big part of it. So how can we use that to drive the player around our dungeon? And like I said, combat also works to sort of ratchet it up and down. But like I said, we want to sprinkle in some downtime. We can do this by creating an interesting vista, or use environmental storytelling, like this in Elemental Deep in Skyrim. It's a crucified fisherman, and you can find this backpack with a little note about how he got there, and how he was going in here to investigate. And that's a little downtime. So it's a way to sort of, intense loot, intense combat, like good loot, that gets the player up here, and then these little like quiet moments gets the player down here. We sort of just want to ride this wave with the player through the dungeon. Also, too much clutter can become distracting to the player. If you put too many things in a room to collect, that's going to be overwhelming. The player's going to feel weighed down. They're going to feel like they have to click on everything. It's definitely a problem that's come up with Fallout 3 and its design, is that there's just stuff everywhere that you can take. And so that's something we've been working a lot on, to sort of figure out like how to get the player to decide what's important in a room to take. And so we do these things like we've lately been clustering our loot a lot, clustering our clutter into spaces that are just obviously the focal point of the room, and leaving the rest of the room kind of not empty, but not full of things for the player to actually interact with. They'd just be visual. Also, too much clutter on the floor hurts navigation. What we like to do with rubble piles a lot in our games is to sort of subtly leave a path open for the player. So we'll have like garbage all over the floor, but there can be like a path that we can sort of justify, like, the people living in this dungeon actually like walk this way, and so they have actually cleared this space. And then the player can use that as a navigation point, even though they don't quite realize they are doing that. They're going to naturally follow these open paths on the floor. So we can use clutter again as a way to navigate the player. So filling the floor up with that clutter is just going to make the player feel overwhelmed and lost. So a lot of the clutter on this map is more detail-oriented. We're starting to add smaller things to the world. We can do more with storytelling. We can put, like, in a room, like 2 dead skeletons. I guess we could have a live skeleton in Skyrim, so that works. But 2 skeletons and maybe a baby carriage, and then we could put some toys in the baby carriage and a bottle, and have an implied story there. And this would be the pass where we start doing those little moments of storytelling. So what we call this pass the Ship with Shame pass, which means by the end of this pass, we should be ready to ship it. Like, this could go in the game. There's things that aren't quite done, but we should be comfortable. This should be at the state where we could have people play this and be okay with it. So we might be missing like a puzzle element that we really wanted, or some cool unique art that we requested early in the project that isn't ready yet. But it should be in a place where the player can play through it and there's no glaring errors at this point. So I mentioned earlier building ships out of planks. All that stuff should be taken out by now. Everything should be real art, and if we don't have it, we either need a plan for it or it needs to be removed. So we're going to be cutting a lot of stuff at this point. Puzzle isn't quite up to stuff, people aren't getting it, cut it. And our request got cut, find a way to make do without it. But we have to be okay with cutting things. Because then we're on to the 4th pass, which is polish and testing. Lots and lots and lots and lots of testing. So at this point, Todd likes to tell us, put a spotlight on what is working in the game. And diminish what isn't. Find the things that our game is good at this point, and find the things that are taking away from that, and sort of move the focus away from them. So if you do have a puzzle in your game that's like in your dungeon that's a little complex, if people aren't getting it and it doesn't quite fit the flow, like I said, our 3 core mechanics, exploration, acquisition, and combat. Puzzles aren't really part of that. Our games aren't really about the puzzles, but they're good ways to affect the pacing. Find ways to focus on what's good. Find ways to focus on the acquisition, exploration, the combat, and then whatever mechanics that we're also developing at the time. Another thing we like to say is great games are played, not made. So we've spent all of the last 3 passes, obviously creating our content, but we've also, like every pass, been getting it in front of other people, trying to get as many people to play it as possible. And this is the phase where it's most important to have people playing our stuff. We really want to personally be playing our own stuff, playing other people's stuff, and having a real discerning eye. Because when you've been playing the game as long as you have by the time you're at 4th pass, where the game's almost shipped, you become blind to a lot of the bugs. Things just become normal to you, like actors pathing without moving their legs and sliding across the floor, and you're like, oh, that's just how people act. But at this point, it's not cool. You can't accept that. And I know a lot of that stuff kind of gets through in our games, and it's because of that attitude. So you want to try as hard as you can to not let anything slide. But the idea is just, everything needs to look polished. So if you see something, say something. So what we do a lot of times is on this last project, we started getting the LDs together to do what we call LD summer camp. So we made these shirts, and we all wore them, and once a week we would get together and play through all of our spaces in the game and just make notes. and get together and just discuss. And it was actually a lot of fun. Like, we got all the level designers together, and we all sort of just, one person would play the level, and everybody else would watch and take notes, and we would save most of the big commentary for afterwards, and then we would have a big group discussion. And every dungeon in Fallout 4 had that treatment. And I think it's going to be very, very good for the game in the end, because every dungeon had 8 people looking at it and having a discussion on it, and like saying what's fun and what's not, what we need to change. And I think this was one of the best things we could have done for the project down the line, for, as far as the dungeons go. So it just all goes back to the theme of just play it and talk about it. And then, of course, bug logging was the same thing. If you see something, say something. You get really good at this point of noticing when things are bad and then documenting them and trying to figure out how this happened, how a bug happened, trying to document what you were doing at the time. We use software called Test Tracker to sort of log all our bugs in our game. And they pile up, but you just have to get really, it goes back to that whole thing about not accepting anything in the game. You know, finding a way to just fix it. Everything needs to get logged, everything you see. We might not necessarily get to fix everything that goes wrong, but as long as it's logged, we have the ability to do it in the future. So once we're at this point, we're doing things, you know, all of our dungeons have had their 4 or 5 passes. We start to do things to really tie the world together as a level design department. So we're thinking outside the dungeon. We're finding ways to really connect the world to itself and get the dungeons feeling like a part of the world, and getting the player, we're trying to like decide where the player is traveling and what the player's routes are throughout the world. We know what the quests are, and so we know where the player is going to be attracted to as they're playing through the game. Another thing we like to think of is like, what is the context of the dungeon in this world? What do people in the nearby town think of this dungeon that's like 2 blocks away? Like this random Draugr cave full of zombies, like how does that affect those people? And another thing we want to think is, how do we bring the player to the dungeon? Maybe the people in that town are bothered by it, so they tell the player about it. Or we could use random encounters, which is something we do a lot of. It's where like somebody will run up to you and it's like, I was just in this dungeon, and I lost my son in there, and you have to go back to it. And you know, just little ways like that to make these dungeons not feel like the separate part of the world, because they have the potential to do that. It's like you enter a dungeon, it's like, well, combat and exploration, it's this gameplay loop. And then we have towns, so how do we make those two feel like they're in the same world? So of course, like I said earlier, we use random encounters sort of as a way to flesh out the world as well. This is one I worked on in Skyrim, the Headless Horseman. And you know, it's not that complex. I just put a guy with no head on a horse, put the ghost shader on him, and had him run to one of my graveyard POI locations. And people have come up with huge theories about this guy's history and like who he was. And you know, it was like a simple thing for me. But you know, like it was like, have him run to this thing. But people will fill in the blanks, and it's just little things like this. Anything you could add to the world to make it interesting and more fleshed out, people will fill in the rest with their heads. It makes the world just feel big. So, like I mentioned earlier, we also do POIs. So at this point, lots more people are playing the game, and like I said, we're going from dungeon to dungeon, quest to quest. We have paths through the world. Where's the player walking, where the world feels empty, where's this big long stretch of nothing, and we go in and fill those spots and try to make you know, things interesting everywhere on the map, so the player can go like through a desert and still have something interesting happen. We can do this with encounters or structures, or having just random characters camping out and talking. We have in Skyrim just these guys on the side of the road drinking beer together, and they offer you a beer. And, like, that's the whole thing. But it's just this little interesting point on the map, and that's what we're trying to do at this point. At this point, we're asking ourselves, what does the world need? What is there not enough of? If we have very few of a specific encounter, maybe try to put more of that in the world. I know, like, at the end of Fallout 3, they decided there weren't enough behemoths around, so they went and put more behemoth locations on the map. Just little things like that. We really, as a department, are trying to serve every other department on the project. You know, an artist spends a lot of time making the behemoth cool, and he has all this cool combat behavior, and if we only see him once or twice in the game, that work is going to waste. So it's our responsibility to make sure that work is out there and getting seen. So my parting thought is just, if you are having fun working on games, the player is going to have fun playing it. It's something that sort of comes up when I do improv too. Is when I'm on stage and when I'm having fun, the audience also has fun. And I think that's something that's really easy to forget when you're working on games, is that, it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of long hours sometimes, but you need to have fun and remember that this is going to bring somebody joy. And if you have joy in making it, it's going to bring people more joy. So I think that's really cool. So that is my talk, but I will take questions. All right, Ron.
Yes. So thank you again for joining us. We also owe a thank you to Courtney Lewis for doing all the legwork for getting Justin down here and helping to make arrangements for Justin. So thank you, Courtney. My question pertains to a thought I hadn't had before until you just mentioned the idea of exterior gameplay spaces, right? And it seems to me, and we played Fallout and Skyrim, that the dungeons are where most of the combat happens, a lot of big combat, a lot of encounters, but then there are some small encounters in those exterior gameplay spaces. Do you think that there's that creates a spectrum where in the future we're going to see games where it's not just those two types, but there's 10 different types, because there's just an increasing ramping up of different combat in different places, and that we don't think of it as dungeon or not.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I think what we're trying to do is blur that line more. Yeah. It's like, we want it to just feel like a living, breathing world, and combat is one of the tools we have, like I said, to create that state of interest and that state of tension and flow. But we want combat to feel like these are people living in the world. Like in Fallout, it's raiders. It's a faction of people trying to survive. And I think that helps tell part of the story of the world, rather than just like, I go here to kill things. I'm going in this raider camp to kill things. So I think we're trying really hard to blur those lines. And, yeah.
So I was wondering, what did you actually do that wowed him? Talk about it again. Were you so impressed with you when you met him?
Yeah, tell me about your level.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, so the level I made, it was a vault for Fallout 3. And it had actually like different levels to it. And the idea is like you would come in, and there were all these people there that were acting kind of funny and weird, and then they were like living in the vault. They like seemed like normal people. And as you got deeper in the vault, there was like this back door that they didn't want you to go to. It was like this locked door, and if you went through it, it's like this more decrepit part of the vault. But everybody like living in that vault was like all happy and smiley and kind of creepy, kind of Pleasantville-y. And if you go in this like secret door, you find it's like filled with robots. And so you fight robots, you go through. It's a cool dungeon experience. I try to implement like all the different gameplay features, locked doors, hacking, different encounters, different scripted sequences where you go through. I had so I'll go through the story of it. So you go down further down, and you find this woman who's like an android. And it turns out she's an AI. Everybody in the whole vault are all androids. They're all AI. And their whole thing was to study human behavior and what emotion is. And so every time like somebody comes down and explores the vault, they would like study them. So they would like keep them in that like upper area and try to like decide what their like modus operandi was and try to like pick them apart. So like as you got deeper in the vault, you like find all these experiments that they're running on people. And so it was fun. You like walk through like prison cells, and there's like all these dead bodies in different poses. And so I tried to integrate story and gameplay together, and I think it just ended up working pretty well.
And how long did you spend on it?
About 2 weeks.
2 weeks, right? So it sounds like a level that could go into Fallout 3 in just 2 weeks' time. So
Did you kind of start moving into level design at that time? I know you honestly didn't really have a portfolio
right.
at the time. Is that when you kind of got into level design, or is that always your passion?
Yeah, I mean, I was, so narrative has always been my direct passion, and then as well as systems design, coming up with overarching design for games. But levels, I've worked on a bunch. While I was here, I made some Portal levels, I made a few levels in Unreal, and it was something I really took to. I've always been really visual. I started out actually as an art major, sort of shifted my focus there. But yeah, I think that the visual elements of level design really attracted me. Oh,
So I read a talk by Joel Burgess the other day, and he said that the kits start out as functional but ugly.
Yep.
So as you're building levels and you're getting more parts to the kit, how does that actually change level design? Because if you build something that's functional and ugly and you don't have everything, like, does that change the layout that you do later on, like in one of the further steps?
yeah, I find maybe 50% of my dungeons, I end up changing a good deal of the layout between first and second pass, and some maybe even a quarter between second and third. There's a lot of kits that get a lot more attention earlier on in the project. So like the Nordic Ruins, for example, was in our vertical slice, so that got fleshed out very, very early. So that means we had a lot of that kit earlier on in the project. So we had, you know, basically like almost full kit on first and second pass. Whereas like the Dwemer Ruins, they came online maybe around when we were doing third passes on most of our other dungeons. So those started very basic, and those ended up changing quite a bit.
Yeah.
And we actually ran into a problem with that kit. It was too big. So we had like, to put the smallest room together would probably be the size of this room.
Yeah.
And so we learn those things as we go through, and yeah, end up changing a lot, a good bit of the layout.
Hey, I got an online question.
Cool.
Has the main character having voiceover affect level design process in Fallout 4?
I have to be really limited what I say about Fallout 4. You know what? I will say no. Just overall in general, no. It hasn't really affected level design. There are ways it's added flavor, but yeah, it hasn't really changed the design in general. So no. Yeah. Right here.
You talked a lot about how you collaborate with artists. Can you go into more how you collaborate with programmers?
Sure. So the biggest thing I mentioned sort of earlier was sort of AI package design. So a lot of times we'll need a specific behavior from an actor. So much I want to talk about on this project. Go back for examples. Okay, so the Draugr in Skyrim had an ambush state. So they would be like sort of up, like, you know, with their arms folded in an active state. And that actually needed a whole new AI behavior set where they would remain in their catacomb until like either triggered or the player hits them. And so we had to work with AI to get a whole new sort of, it's what we call packages, just a set of behaviors on how they react to certain actions by the player. So we work with them a lot. And then also on scripting systems. So we have a scripting programmer called his name's Jeff Levine, and he developed a proprietary scripting language for us called Papyrus. And in a while, we will need Papyrus to do something that he didn't, you know, make a level designer's life easier on just tools, ways to back forms, a lot of things like that.
So not seeing the rest of the game, is that not allowed, or?
It's not that it's not allowed, it's just that we dungeons, we had a dungeon in Skyrim where the whole idea was like to move light around using mirrors, and allows us to do a lot of what we want to do. So when we do unique things in dungeons, a lot of times we're actually working on it, and we just sometimes get script to be more powerful to serve.
And I just wanted you to talk more about working on like secret projects in general, and specifically this one in nowhere. Like, what is it like to work on something for probably years, I assume?
Yeah.
Anything about it?
I mean, it was obviously pretty frustrating. We intentionally waited this long to announce the game, and we had, yeah, I wish I could have, sometimes you wish you could work with more people outside of the industry. You know, just brainstorm as a tool to maybe come up with ideas for a story I want to come up with or something. But, you know, those are the things we're discouraged from doing because we can't let it get out there. So it's also kind of cool to be secretive all the time, right? We can't tell you what I'm working on.
This prior to announcing Fallout 4, there were several hoaxes.
I mean, I'm not worried about it. Like, for something to be released, and, you know, we may or may not know where those things came from, but we're not going to let that affect, you know, our day-to-day work. There wasn't like security or anything like that. It's just we're not going to comment on it, and that's going to be the most we react.
consolidate some of the loot and stuff into centralized locations, which is a good idea because I can remember playing Fallout 3 and like it was fun, but it wasn't fun. So it's good that you're centralizing loot, but how do you balance it and make the player feel like it's not too easy to find cool stuff? Because if it's too easy, how do you balance that?
I think that we want every player to be nosy and who are sticking their nose in more like random corners and like experimenting to get more. So, I make a hidden area so cool that I'm like, I wish I didn't make it hidden because I want everybody to see this. But I always try to have a reward for those people who are a little bit more industrious. So we have what's called the golden path. And the golden path is what everybody's gonna do. It's where everybody's gonna go from beginning to end. But then you can sort of branch it. I've been experimenting a lot more with. There's been, just a little possibility of having sort of maybe have that be software based. Have something be tracking people playing. And that's definitely. I don't know how helpful that data would be for every specific dungeon, but I think definitely for golden path type stuff, getting people through the game. But I think too much of that could kind of be detrimental to the spirit of just this exploration of just random little places in the dungeons. And maybe 1,000 people will find this little part, but I spent an hour making it, I crafted it. A few people will get to see it, and that's cool. Like, why does everybody have to see every part? And that's kind of the charm of a lot of our games, is everybody gets to have their own little version of their experience.
So you track all the glitches. How many do you see that are like, because it's for now, like Skyrim, I walked out of a dungeon and there was a deer's butt sticking out of a rock. It's like, oh, that's sweet. Like, how many of that, how many like, just like, that's okay, like, because obviously.
Well, like I said, we never.
We track them.
Yeah, we never say that's okay. We track it. The goal is to make all of them. I mean, I know people like them. They're silly, it's fun. But the goal is to not have any. They happen. We have big games with a lot of different systems interacting, and it's hard to see everything. So, we fix what we can, we fix what we see, but when it comes down to it, we're a team of 100 people. We have QA of maybe 100 people, but when it gets in front of millions of people, there's way more ways to play it than we can ever anticipate. Those things are going to happen, but yeah, we never want to keep them. Yes.
Do you look at multiple dungeons at a time, or do you stick with one and play it and move on?
So yeah, I should have mentioned this earlier with the iterations, is that we do all passes at a time. So we do all our pass zeros, we do all our pass ones, we do all our pass twos. So we're going through every dungeon in sequence, and then or at least we try. Like I said, the Dwemer kit came on, the Dwarven Ruins kit came on really late, so we had to start those passes a little bit later in the project. But the idea is to get as much time between working on the dungeon on each pass as possible.
Off of that, so when you're doing your pass zero, you kind of know how many dungeons are going to be in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, sometimes we'll add a few in the end. We'll have more that we need, but we have a general idea. Back here.
Back here. Stuff you can do with the scripting tools that are more edited and stuff that you need for tech guys to program and break down the line.
It's funny, we try to push that line as hard as we can. We try to do as much as we can. Just in my department, we try to do as much as we can without needing them. Code time is very valuable on our project. They're working on performance, they're working on a lot of like high-risk things. So we try to do as much as we can. And the scripting language of Papyrus is actually really new. We got it in Skyrim. And so this is the first time we've really been pushing what designers can actually implement in the game. So we do a lot with like magic system. We do a lot with different abilities and things, puzzles, things like that we were never able to do before. That would have all had to go to code past. But there comes times when there's just something that's not possible and we have to push it through. But we try to do as much as we can with scripting. Yes.
What do you think about random level generation in combination with the iterative design process?
Well, I mean, I could see that being useful as a seed for developing a dungeon, but it's interesting because you can use random generation as a way to create variation in the game, to create the amount of spaces that we have in our games quicker, because obviously it takes us years and years to make that amount of spaces, whereas randomly generated spaces, you can just churn them out. But you also need sort of that sort of unique human element. So I think we would want to go through, maybe randomly generate a space and then go through and put a little bit of that human touch on it. So there is a way for those ideas to interact, especially because humans would be the ones maybe creating the pieces that random generation would use. But I think there's a lot of potential there, but it's not something, you know, that you could just randomly generate and leave alone. You would probably want to work on it some more and take it through those iterations.
I know you can't talk a lot about it, but there's been talk online from official sources of Fallout 4 having twice the assets of Skyrim. How does that affect?
And that was voice assets specifically.
Okay, that was voice assets? Okay.
That was voice
but,
assets specifically.
There was also the crafting system that was mentioned. And how did that affect clutter? Because I know clutter in Skyrim, like there is a crafting system,
right,
but it isn't as intense.
I would say like just those general directions that I mentioned earlier, of just wanting to keep a clutter contained. The reason that we're working on that is because it is huge, like the amount of stuff that you can pick up in our game. So, yeah, it definitely was affected by that system.
This sort of in a way talks to the random generation human aspect to it. Because as a team of 8 of you, do you guys, for level designers, do you guys encourage that you put your own player into your dungeons, or do you try to keep things similar across? Like, should you play a dungeon and just instantly know, oh, Joel did this,
yeah,
right?
yeah, actually, absolutely. Everybody has their own style. Like, we all have just little quirks that we all have. So yeah, there are ways that you can tell. Like, yes, I know who designed this dungeon. This person always has a teleporting boss, for example. Everybody knows who games it work. But yeah, we all have our own unique style. Like some people like to make them more difficult, some people are more narrative in nature, you know. And I think that's good. It's more variety in the world. But then there's also a sharing of ideas. Like a lot of times we'll like the way another person builds something, and we'll sort of take that on. So it's a fun interaction. But just we're very close as a group. Like we all try to get together and share ideas and work together. And while we do have our own signatures, we also learn from each other.
Do you find sort of like with your background in art and also doing improv, you take a more narrative flair to your own design?
Yeah, personally, I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Short
personally,
answer.
I would say. Yeah.
Right here?
Do you guys get inspired by the modding communities working on your level?
Absolutely, yeah. We are continuously inspired by the things the modding community does. There's a reason we really encourage modders, because it helps our community, and it also helps see what people want from our games. Because if we're not giving it to them, they're going to make it, and then we can see what people are craving, and I think that's a very powerful tool.
We spoke briefly at lunch about open worlds, and so I think it'd be interesting for you to talk more at length about the idea of if an open world fails in its mission, being a good open world, what do you think the problems were in that?
Yeah, open world is definitely a sort of a term of the day these days. A lot of games are working on that level. I think the question with open worlds is how do you fill it? It's this big open world. What is it full of? What is the player doing? And there's a lot of different ideas on what that means. But I mean, I know Bethesda has a very specific goal in our open world, and that's just to. It goes along with environmental storytelling, feeling like a real world, trying as hard as we can to make the world feel living and breathing, having this interaction between different cities and different people. Yeah, I think it comes down to just making the world feel alive and interesting. There is sort of this idea of
There is
whether Bethesda games
sort of
maybe
this
feel
idea
a little bit
of
too much like theme
whether
parks.
Bethesda games
Like,
maybe
you know,
feel
everything's
too much
interesting,
like
everything's
theme parks.
squished together, why does
Like,
everything
you know,
have this huge
everything's
story?
interesting,
But I
everything's
think that's
stitched
sort of
together,
what you're
why does
looking
everything
for in
have
a game.
this huge
I think
story?
you want all these
But I think
really
that's
interesting
sort of
moments and all
what
these things to be
be
within reach, but also to feel immersed in the world. So it's a balance, because if it feels like a theme park, then you know you're not as immersed. You're like, oh, this is all too convenient. But you also don't want it to feel dead. So it's a delicate balance there. Yeah, just because you can go where you want doesn't necessarily make it, you know. But I think another powerful thing for open world is the ability for the player to be able to tell their own stories. So, like in our games, we have a main story, but the player can leave it and go be whoever they want, join whatever faction. There's a lot of role playing involved there. So I think that's also a very powerful tool for open world games.
So I think that's also a very powerful tool.
Earlier on, this whole talk's been about the iterative design approach. You listed out some pros of it. Are there any like road pitfalls or things to watch out for that might give you trouble?
Yeah, I would say that because we're going from dungeon to dungeon constantly, like maybe I'll spend 3 days on a medium-sized dungeon at a time. Sometimes I don't have the time to put in as much detail as I would like on a specific pass. So a lot of times on iterative design, you throw things down the line. You say, oh, I'll do that in the next pass. And that becomes dangerous because by the time you're at the final pass, you have all these things you want to do and things are getting busier and busier. So you have to realize that you need to spend time in the earlier passes when you have time to do it. For example, like a lot of writing on this last project I saved for maybe third pass because I was like, oh, I can write later. But then once I was on third pass, I was working on like a huge amount of clutter and encounters and things like that, so I didn't have time to write on a lot of dungeons the things I intended on writing. So I wish I would have saved that for earlier passes. It's just about spending your time where you have it. And that's supposed to be the power of it, but it kind of allows you to procrastinate a little bit, so you gotta watch out for that. Yeah, first one.
What would you say is your favorite dungeon that you made in Skyrim that you would like to solve and try?
I would say
couple.
I'll say Illanalta's Deep, which is just this like it's basically on Lake Illanalta, which is near the front start. It's like a castle submerged in a lake. I like the vibe of it. It's got all this like water in it. It's pretty neat. I like it.
It's got all this like water in it. It's pretty neat.
With decision stacks, especially the paths that you have locked off at a certain point, how do you decide how long before the player should gain whatever they have to gain access to that path?
So the goal is it's okay as long as like the player remembers it's there, because as soon as they forget where it was, you sort of kind of ruin the whole effect. So you have to make it seem significant enough. Like if the player comes upon a door that, in our games, for example, a message will come up that says key required, or usually if we like make it master locked, that a player is going to remember that. Whereas like we have like novice and advanced lockpicking that lower levels can do, and that seems a little more insignificant. But I think the moment that you make something, you highlight it, you put a spotlight on it, you make it seem important. A player is going to remember it for as long as they're in the dungeon and look for a key for it, which sometimes is bad, because sometimes we lock a door because a quest needs you to go there. And so it's kind of a balance. So for those times, we want to not highlight the door and try to make it like, wait till you're guided here later. So that's sort of a delicate balance to play with there too.
You said that you'll spend about 3 days in dungeon at a time. Is that the average amount of time you spend per pass on an average size dungeon?
Yeah, we're working on metrics as more and more projects continue. And each project sort of requires a different amount of time for dungeons. But I would say I think we have metrics for our dungeons that go small, medium, large, very large, POIs. POIs will spend like a day on per pass, whereas like a small would probably be about 3. And then we have certain passes that we add more days to, but yeah, that's sort of a changing number because it's always different depending on the project.
What caps good for some game did you work on at FIEA?
Sold from scratch. Yeah.
And do you think if there was anything specific at FIEA that you really carried, like one thing that you
Yeah, I would say so. So I really like the rapid prototyping here. It's just going through project after project. It's sort of similar to, you know, jumping around from level to level. But another thing that is also really cool at Bethesda is that the entire team is considered sort of designer on the game. Everybody is able to pitch ideas. We all submit feedback. We all get together. We all have different ideas for the game. And so every few years we do a Bethesda Game Jam. And we get together and we work on just like creating stuff that we wanted to put in the game or just something silly. It doesn't even have to be like something that definitely has to be in the game. So we all get together and we just come up with all these cool game ideas. And it sort of feels like the spirit of RPP here. I definitely took that with me. Just creating for the spirit of creating. Get it fast, get it done, fail fast, so that you can like recover from it. There's a lot of really good things that I've learned from that I've applied to those game jams and just my work in general. Yeah, yeah.
Really enjoyed that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Going off the game jam thing, has everybody talked of doing kind of the Far Cry Blood Dragon kind of standalone DLC thing off of a game jam?
I mean, that would be awesome. I would like that, but yeah, nothing like that has come up.
What's your, okay, this is just gonna be a question. What's your favorite race and class and guild in the Elder Scrolls?
Okay.
This is very
Okay.
important.
God, you are gonna judge me so hard.
Oh my gosh.
All right, I like the Khajiit.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Khajiit has wares.
Sorry.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're awesome.
Well, yeah.
To play as a cat person. Yeah, I played as Khajiit a lot when I was testing the game. So Guild. Oh.
So Guild.
Probably the Dark Brotherhood. Yeah.
We know.
And then what was the other one?
The class.
Class. Oh, anything magic.
What was the other one?
Yeah.
Class.
Probably illusion magic. Yeah. Yeah. Hey.
Why aren't there more ladders in the game?
You know what? Programmers have reasons. We've been asking for them forever. Hey.
So one of the big things now is like YouTube streams. People, like everyone watches everyone else play the games, and so there's already some. You have to assume there's already some level of familiarity with the player knowing your game, probably before they've ever even bought it.
Yeah.
Does that level of like assuming the player may know something go into when you've done? Like, do you try to predict like, well, maybe they've already seen it before. What can we do? Like, randomize it up. Like, you talk a lot about random events, points of interest randomly occurring in the world, but do you try to do that also inside the dungeons? And kind of do you plan trying to counteract like maybe they've already seen this, where you let the like lots of class and speech options differentiated, so that they've seen it, they're experiencing it their own way.
I mean, we try to keep every dungeon to support multiple play styles and to support different ways of playing it as much as we can. So I think that's something that's already something that has been in our minds. And we also talk a lot about Bethesda. Back in the day, before YouTube was a big thing, they would talk about a lot of not YouTube, but like Let's Plays, about water cooler moments. Like the next day, with multiple people are playing the game, they get together and talk about it. That everybody had their own experience, and so we always try to have that. Like everybody can talk about the same game and be like, oh, well, for me it happened this way, and for me it happened this way, and it could happen different ways for everybody. So that's something we've always been really aware of. So hopefully that translates to YouTube watches. Anything else?
What's your most memorable like industry social story since like being out? Because I know you went to E3 and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I love going to GDC. It's probably one of my favorite because there's just this cool energy and sharing of ideas between everybody in the industry. And there's just so much ambition and so much hope for like what gaming can be. And like there's just so many ideas being shared. I love going to there, seeing all the talks, and hopefully I would like to get into that someday, doing talks there. But that's a little bit off. Right here.
For these client producers of the room, could you talk about your relationship with them?
Oh yeah. how could I forget about producers? I'm sorry. So producers are responsible for our schedules, obviously, but they're also bug logging. They're sort of they manage where those bugs go. So we'll enter a bug in tracker. It'll get an ID number, and then we sort of like say vaguely what department we think it goes to, and then they have to sort of figure out who the bug goes to, who's in charge of it. And it's also what I was talking about with metrics with him over here is that, you know, they try to decide what as a group, you know, what allocation of time we need for each pass or to get certain things done. A lot of times random passes will come up where the entire level design team needs to like go throughout the whole world and add a certain item in, make sure it's everywhere. And so they have to accommodate that and adjust the schedule. So yeah, there's a lot of interaction between producers. Stuff is always coming up. We also do what we call strike teams, where sometimes we'll drop everything and put a group of people on a certain feature, and we'll put a producer in there just to make sure everything gets allocated correctly and everybody's spending their time wisely. A lot of times we'll run those meetings. So yeah, producers are great. Love them. Right here.
The creation engine that made that was used for Skyrim was updated for Fallout 4.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any way that the different like change engine changed the way that you had to do certain things in the game?
Absolutely. Well, wait, it like creating for creators?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's what I was talking about with tools. So we're basically always updating the editor, what's called the creation kit. So yeah, we actually got a lot of new editor features when that switched over, and even on this new project, our editor is always evolving. We always get like cool new ways to sort of streamline our process. So that was actually a big shift for us, and that's also when Papyrus got added. So yeah, changed it a lot.
What would you say Bethesda is looking for and people that are applying for jobs for them?
I mean, we definitely look at portfolio. Another thing that just seems to be important is just the culture of our studio is very important to everybody there. And so it's a lot about just if we feel you fit into the sort of culture of it, we like to just have good people who work together well. So we put people who interview through like an entire day of meeting people, hanging out, going to lunch, just making sure people really fit. Yeah, so it's very important to us there.
So that's very important to us there.
So what is your best advice for students who are both starting out, cohort 12, and those who are rounding up cohort 11?
Well, I mean, you have your portfolio pieces that have come from here, or you will if you're cohort 12. But you're never done. Like, keep creating, keep trying to make more. You know, the best way that I could show you want to make games is by making games. And, you know, even if you don't get a job immediately, find a way to make games. It's the best thing. It's going to be the thing that will move you forward. And there's so many ways to do it now. Yeah, there's sort of no excuse to not be if that's what you want to do. Just keep making games.
No excuse to not be if that's what you want to do. Just keep making games.
Cool.
Thank you all very much for coming out. For those of you who haven't officially met me, my name is Courtney Lewis, and I am your Industry Relations Coordinator. We have a pretty exciting lineup of speakers that will be touring through this year, so please make sure that you keep a lookout for advertisements for talks. If you think of a question that you didn't ask Justin already, we'll be at the Lodge and the Woods at 5:30 for happy hour. So if you stop by, we'll be there. And thank you all very much for coming out. Have a great week and a greater weekend.